Somewhat late, we're gaveling in the second work session of the day. Here, the day being Friday, March 1st, and I didn't ask you yet. At 1:12 for a work session on AO number 2019-12, the Central Business District Tax Exemption. Mr. Train. He's here.
Forrest Dunbar. Pete Peterson. Christopher Constant. Felix Vera.
Austin Quinn Davidson.
Eric Croft.
Gretchen Wemhoff.
Mr. Dyson was here, and I think will be again. Okay. Mr. Schutte, did you want to say anything, or you just wanted us to do work session stuff?
I'm pleased to be here.
Yes, you are. Who requested this and why?
Oh, I think I did not request it, but I think that we had a lot of questions, and I remember at the meeting we decided that we needed more information, more time. I just recall that conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think I got a request, but I don't remember from who to do it. Are there questions of the members of Mr. Schutte, the administration, of Dean, of anyone? Yeah, Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a general question. I thought we had some discussion about a possible S version, and I know there were some amendments as well. I know I have an amendment that Mr. Gates is working on as well.
Maybe that'd be a structure. Mr. Gates, what amendments are you working on, if the member wanted you to say?
As I recall, I drafted some amendments for Ms. LaFrance, and I think that they were before us in copies of this room. If I'd overlooked something additional, sorry, but I think that we had already brought the amendments forward at the meeting.
Maybe we can get those amendments, Madam Clerk, so that we can. And what?
You can put me on the list to talk later about it. I just got some questions.
Ms. LaFrance, what was the intent of your amendment? Do you recall? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but just generally describe it.
No, it's a fair question. I'm trying to find my notes.
I can ask the questions again if you want to gather.
Okay, then Ms. Wemhoff and then Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Okay.
While we're working on that.
And mine's a question. This is a. I don't. My question is, we're going to hear from both sides of this, and I'm wondering. What I'm hearing a lot of is maybe unfair, maybe produce, and let's forget the unfair. Perhaps it might produce a situation that is economically not equal for another area of Anchorage, another developer. And are there any discussions or concepts or thoughts for the writers of this of creating something that's more, that expands more into it? And I know, Mr. Constant, you're very involved in this, so maybe you can answer this. That perhaps we can communicate. Can we expand this with language that does not take away from what we're doing, but it adds to what's going on in the rest of Anchorage? In other words, incentives maybe at a different percentage. Has there been discussions such as that, rather than just going one? That's kind of where my question is.
I had Ms. Quinn Davidson, Mr. Trainee, and Mr. Constant, but was that directed at?
Yeah, Mr. Constant probably can help me out.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you turn to page 5, under the definition section, you will see line 19, in parentheses, the number 1.
Okay, thank you.
The intent behind this is to implement and test and see that it functions as anticipated, and then contemplate what items number 2, 3, 4, 5, and ad infinitum might move down to. And so the specific question of, are there other mechanisms? The answer is absolutely yes, and in fact this is structured in a way to do that. But the intent is to implement it in a small targeted area so that we can see if it in fact does what it's intended to do. And then in a not too long point in the future, move it to Spenard or the Eagle River business area or other areas that we deem in need of incentivization. So yes, it's actually baked into the structure of the ordinance as it's written.
Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sheedy, we've talked a bit about whether 12 years is the appropriate number, and I know we've heard a lot of suggestions of different numbers and some possible amendments that maybe weren't introduced, but I just want to understand why 12 is the magic number. I know you talked with developers and that's what everyone thought, but why? Because we're in a position where we need to answer that to the folks who are asking.
Thank you. Through the chair, Chris Sheedy, Director of Office of Economic and Community Development. 2 points. First, as Assemblyperson Constant mentioned, this is a tool that goes in a toolbox. Where we choose to use that toolbox, it's deliberately designed to be specific and apply to one location only. And by nature of taking a targeted approach to your reinvestment priorities, you are, in essence, saying we prefer this area over another. And that's the intent of this. There's no two ways about it. It is designed to create the equity that does not exist in a free market system now. If the free market system performed equitably, you would have seen the same level of investment in downtown Anchorage probably as you've seen in other parts of town. We haven't. What are the barriers to that? That's exactly what this seeks to address, are the barriers to that kind of investment in an area that needs it. And as this product has stood up and is seen to be successful, the plan is to move it strategically through other parts of the community, and Mr. Constant answered that correctly. Specifically, though, to your point on the 12 years. 12 years is not a magic number. There is no single magic number that will be a universal solve-all to every development project that comes to the door. However, looking at the development costs that downtown carries, the development cost burdens that downtown carries, 12 was the number that seemed to deliver the most benefit to the widest variety of project types. So, as you can imagine, with a smaller development, there are higher costs per square foot sometimes than in larger developments when we're talking steel construction. In order for this to be beneficial to even our smaller developers, which we do want to encourage, it was found that 12 years to provide the maximum benefit across the greatest spectrum of development types. I don't know if you're going to call on people today, but there's some really great numbers that have been shared by Inland Housing on their total development cost of a project that you can see going up right outside our front door, and how that pencils or doesn't pencil in a true market environment. And based on the numbers that project has demonstrated, that others have shared with us, we settled on the 12-year term because it was the amount of time that actually delivers the cost savings on an annual basis that allows these projects to truly be successful.
Mr. Train, do you have more?
Just a
Good,
quick
yeah.
follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Sheedy, that's really helpful. So, as to the next areas that we might implement this, is this similar or different than the RFAs?
So, thank you. Through the chair, think of this as a tool in your toolbox. This is a screwdriver that we just bought at Home Depot. We're putting in our toolbox. Where we take that toolbox to fix problems is the next step. So
But is that through the RFAs or is it
Correct.
a different thing?
It's
Okay,
through the
so that's the
RFAs.
process you're referring to as the next steps?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Trainee.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I've just got some concerns. I understand the toolbox, but I think we're trying to put the Phillips into flathead screw. You're not going to get it done correctly. It's a 12-year downtown, and this is not going to help us with the workforce development housing, which we desperately all agree we need in this town. I don't see this area conforming to that requirement to provide workforce affordable housing. I would rather see this in other parts of Anchorage and try it there, and that'll produce the type of housing that we need for people, average jobs. This won't do that. I want to understand you're talking about homeless, what, 500,000 to over 1.5 million? That's not affordable by most Anchorage residents. I've got a problem doing this.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you. So I first wanted to ask a question of you, Mr. Crawford. I think that Chris alluded to it, but I do see Tyler Robinson from CHA in the back. And I want to make sure we have time to hear from them, because they're the only ones who have actually built housing downtown in the last decade or so. So I want to make sure they have a chance.
We could do that right now briefly if you wanted, if that would add to the dialogue.
Or we could wait till the end. How would you preference?
No, I'm able to speak, I think.
Introduce yourself so the tape recorder can hear it.
Sir, Mr. Chair, members, Tyler Robinson, Cook Inlet Housing Authority. I think what I wanted to share, Jeff Judd and I, we ran some numbers related to our Elizabeth Place development that's under construction right now. That is considered a mixed income development. That used actually some different tools in the municipality's toolkit, including municipal land, municipal community development block grant and some state and federal resources to get what we consider to be an affordable housing development with some unrestricted unit. 25% of them are both workforce and perhaps beyond workforce units. When we run that project, not as a low-income housing tax credit development, but as a market rate project, we're able to leverage about 40% of the cost of the development in debt. Okay? So imagine you've got a $13, $14 million project, and you can really only leverage 40% of that in debt. So what you end up with is you could assume that an owner, a developer, would put in 25% additional equity, 25%, right, of an investment, and expect a return on that investment. But you're still left with a 35% gap, an equity gap. What that is to tell me is, and that's with it, so you add that 12-year abatement period in there, you're going to start to chunk away at that equity gap, but you may not. The floodgates will not open. You will not suddenly have a whole bunch of applications for housing, but what you may have is a hotel that adds 2 or 3 levels of floors of housing into it. Or you may have a commercial development that's able to add some element in it. So there's other ways that a developer can begin to get creative to say, hey, can we get, or you might get an 8-unit townhouse on the outskirts of the CBD or in East Downtown, right? And so the point is, what I'm here to say is, the challenges everywhere are substantial. The challenges are greater in downtown.
Did that get what you wanted?
Yeah, but I want to do a follow very briefly. So just what Mr. Trainee said about workforce development housing, or workforce housing. The first thing is, this is one part of a much broader strategy. Things like 2040, but even things like the rezone we just debated. But workforce in particular, last night, or I guess Tuesday night, we voted to move the bus barn. That was to free a piece of property to build a bunch of workforce housing right next to our largest employment center, which is UMed, right? So this isn't in a vacuum. There was one last thing, but
Can I come back around? I got 6 people on the list. We still got plenty of time on this, but we'll eat it up. Mr. Dyson, you want me to put you back on, Mr.
Yeah, thank you.
You want to get back on?
We want to pay attention to a couple of things. In general, our law system does not bind a future assembly from changing it. So, Mr. Schutte, I suspect that what we're doing here is not contract law, and this body could go back and change it to 10 years or 3 weeks if we wanted, could we not?
Through the chair, that you can change the code, and the code provisions we're proposing are proposing 12 years. A future body can come back and change the code provisions to a different amount of time. However, any project that is successfully granted that 12-year tax abatement prior to a future assembly changing it would receive the 12-year benefit. But if at a later date, to Tyler's point, if at a later date the legislative body feels that this tool has achieved its purpose or is going too strong and it would take the foot off the gas pedal, you can certainly change the terms at a later date for all projects after that point.
Yeah, and if I may, I ignorantly disagree with you. And so you're saying the tax portion of it is contract. It can't be altered.
Correct.
You want to think on that? Stu, on that?
Well, yeah, I do, and I'm going to get my colleague here to tell me to back up your.
Great. Ms. LaFrance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The amendment that Mr. Gates is drafting for me has to do with expanding it to other areas without using the language of the reinvestment focus areas, since that's not developed yet. So it's more of a general statement about moving in that direction. Second, when I think about this more in terms of providing incentive for economic development, it almost makes a little more sense, and that the housing piece, even though it says tax incentives for housing and in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, whereas it talks about to address the housing shortage, in a way that seems secondary to the actual intent of this, unless I've misunderstood. Yes, to create a population base, but one of the main criticisms has been this is not going to provide affordable housing. And down the road, there could be a ripple effect where if you have more supply in one area, it can free up. But I understand that's not necessarily the focus. to provide that. So I wanted to make sure I understood that correctly, that when we think of housing shortage, we're mostly thinking about affordable housing, and this doesn't necessarily do that. And I had a third question. The other objection we received has to do with the whole perception that other taxpayers will be subsidizing taxes in this area. And you know, like if there's a mixed use, there's existing an existing structure of property that there'll be property taxes paid for, and not for the new residential part. Would it be possible to present any scenarios showing that, okay, if there is a fourplex development and none of that is on the tax roll, what is the impact? Or like,
You got all those, Mr. Schutte,
I
in your
think
head?
so. Let me do my best here.
Yeah, I'm going to delay you so that you'll forget one. So what was handed out was what we have before us now, because there were amendments that we adopted. So you'll see on page 2 some clarifying language. Page 3, the deadline, so they put a sunset, if you will, of 2024. We did, I think, LaFrance amendments, the various amendments. And then on page 5, an annual report. That may have been a Weddle thing. Anyway, we did a couple of, we didn't address the sort of big issues of how long and other areas, but we did various clarifying amendments that are here.
How long did they make?
Yeah, the period. Well, we did sunset it in 2024. Mr. Schutte, you got them all three?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Thank you. So to the first point about an amendment or proposal to make this eligible for other areas, we've said it before in these work sessions and we'll say it again, we would be opposed to that simply because this is designed to be a strategic tool for a specific area. And we would like to see this implemented in other areas as those projects become ripe. Downtown is ripe now and it's ready to strike. We'd like to see this tool implemented here, and it's strategic in its nature. The RFAs, the statutory language to implement the RFAs is forthcoming. As part of that, the RFAs will not, the framework will not only be established, but so will some of the initial RFAs, or the initial RFA, which covers portions of Spenard and Midtown. So at that time, the conversation around the type of incentivization that's needed in that area will become part of the conversation. The danger of adding this 12-year tax abatement tool to areas outside of downtown is we have not run the analysis of those other parts of town to make sure that this is the appropriate tool for those neighborhoods. Every neighborhood has different development costs and different development challenges. This one is tailored specifically to downtown. And at a future date, as the RFAs come online and as the residential priorities or the housing priorities of those areas are known, that will be addressed in the tools that are specific to those RFAs. So we would encourage the body to not expand this to other areas at this time. This is crafted specifically for the downtown area and the challenges that are unique to downtown. We'd like to see it stay that way.
Did he get all three
Just
of
one.
your
I'm gonna
questions?
keep going
Just
if I
one.
can.
Yep, keep going, yeah.
Is that okay? To the second point, to the third point, I'll skip ahead. To the third point about the burden that this places on other property tax owners, that's currently provided for in the ordinance in section 3. Specifically, we added language modifying Title 12, I believe it is, Title 14, that will keep these properties off of the tax rolls until such time as the tax abatement term expires. In other words, as a $12 million project comes online, you will not see that $12 million project included in the calculation of the tax cap, which is how other taxpayers would have to pick up the bill. For all intents and purposes, that $12 million of value doesn't exist until year 13. To your point about the other parts of a property, during that 12-year period, all land continues to be taxed at normal rate. Land values will continue to appreciate during that time, so tax revenue from the eligible portions or the taxable portions will continue to climb. And then in your example of commercial properties, same story. A commercial property on the ground floor will continue to appreciate at the normal rate, and regular tax collection does occur from those. Keep in mind that in a mixed-use environment, we're talking about a tool that can bring online an overall project that would not have come online at all if not for this tax abatement. So while we may be exempting 4 floors of residential, for example, That one floor of ground floor retail would not have come online without this tool that incentivized the developer to invest in that project. So it's a way to increase the tax base even during that 12 years of abatement. In year 13, we're talking about a big jump.
Quick follow-up.
Yeah.
I missed your number 2, so I did forget it.
Well, and the objection from some folks has been,
Quote meatloaf.
that property may not be included in the tax property or counted in there, but other folks are still paying the costs for those people who live there for services such as police and fire and whatever else is there.
So in a sense, the tax burden of other property owners is not affected. It does not go up. Are the tax dollars of a resident who is paying property tax covering services that may or may not be used by this property? Absolutely. And that's, we're fine to accept that.
Mr. Constant, I have a lot of people on the list.
Yeah, so first, I misdirected you slightly when discussing where in the ordinance it actually is. And now that we have this new version, it's a slightly different place. It's actually on the page 2 of the new ordinance, and it's line 33. But I looked at the definitions for some reason. And so that was really it, and I'm not going to belabor any other points.
Okay, good. Or thank you. Ms. Wimhoff.
Yeah, my question, I keep going back between rental properties and condominiums that are owned. And so I hear people talk about rentals more than condominiums, but I'm not, my first question is there a difference? Is one included in this and not the other? And then the second one is, is when let's say you have 4 condos and they sell them, what you and I were talking about, Mr. Schutte, before, and just trying to bring this out so we can discuss it, that if I decide to buy one of those condos, then I don't have to pay taxes for 12 years, that this follows that. So that's something I think is worthy of discussion. I think that's great. I'll go move downtown into one of these properties because I'm not going to have to pay taxes. But I'm not sure that doesn't seem like that was the intent of the process. So if we can discuss that.
Thank you. Through the chair. Yes, you are correct in that the benefit for this incentive does travel with the property or with the land. So in the case the example that you gave of a condo being sold, yes, the owner of that condo technically would receive the benefit for whatever duration of time remains on the overall property. However, what a developer is more than likely going to do is to boost the price of that unit in order to recognize that benefit. If a developer receives a tax abatement and spends all the money and time and energy in constructing something, they need to receive the fruit of that benefit. The only way to do that is through an increase in the price of the sale price of the unit, or as we've heard some developers talk, in a condo setting where you have a homeowners association, there could be an annual fee or a monthly fee attached to your condo unit. That is the repayment mechanism for that incentive up front. So in other words, if the developer receives $1 million tax abatement over the 12 years, that will be repaid to the developer through those HOA fees. That's not dealt with in this because we're not in the business of micromanaging the HOAs or the private market. The private market will solve that problem. We believe that they're best equipped to solve it, and it'll probably be through one of those 2 methods.
Just to follow up on
Yeah.
that. So what I heard was that the developer might want to try to get some, if they're not being taxed for 12 years, is there really any money to get back by passing that incentive on? I mean, that if there's no money in the beginning, then what is there to try to get back in a profit by raising the price of the condo?
Right. So the intent of the incentive is to provide people the nudge that they need to make the initial investment to construct residential properties. Now, if you're constructing a condo or for sale product, you're looking at a benefit that supposedly enticed you to do something, but you're never going to receive that benefit if you're turning and selling properties right away. A savvy developer more than likely will figure out a way to recoup that benefit. In my example, it was, say, $1 million over 12 years. And they'll accomplish that either by boosting the sale price with the caveat that if you buy this condo, yes, it's got a 25% premium, but you will not pay taxes for 12 years. Or alternatively, through an HOA or other mechanism, they could just get $2 million through monthly or annual contributions from the residents.
So the developer can basically control a price in trade for someone not having to pay taxes. I'm just really
The
think
market
that's
sets-
something we.
the market sets the price, so they'll set
The market
price.
sets the price, but I'm still back on developer impacting taxes from someone else. That's-
Can we-
Yeah.
Can we circle back on that? I'm next on the list, but I just like Mr. Debenham, if you wanted to comment. I know you have a lot of concerns about this. Briefly, but we want to hear them.
Sean Debenham, just wanted to point out, in the last 15 years, there's only been one market rate apartment complex that's been built. That was by me. So the need for housing is not just in downtown, it's actually throughout the Anchorage Bowl. The 2012 Anchorage housing analysis confirmed that when it said that it doesn't pencil right now. So I fully support these tools that the municipality is coming out with. The problem where I have heartburn is that I'm not in the circle of people who are getting the tools. I have an apartment complex that I'm working on doing this summer, and because I'm outside of this kind of circle area, I'm not going to probably be able to move forward. And then again, if they start adding more circles, the more circles that they add, the greater the competition is for me, and the harder it is for me to develop, because I'm always outside of those circles that are receiving the 12-year tax abatements. So if they decide to go to, Muldoon next or wherever, every time they add a circle, it just makes it that much harder for me to develop, because all of my competitors have 12-year property tax abatements that I don't need to use.
Unless you're in the circle.
Unless you're in the circle, correct. But I'm not in the circle, I'm in your district.
Well, I know, but the areas that you have developed or are considering developing are under consideration to be in the circle. I mean, those are some of the Spenard areas and the trailer park, and even some of the Sand Lake are reinvestment areas or targeted city center areas in the 2040 plan.
So, yeah, we do have one of our two properties is potentially in the future might be one of the circles. That's correct, but the one we currently have is
Not. Gotcha.
Trying to do.
Appreciate that. Questions for this?
Yes.
Yeah, they'll be fine there. And then I have Weddleton, Dunbar, Peterson, and Constant in the list.
So, I think you said you're developing an apartment house?
Correct.
Yeah. My guess is the vacancy rate is fairly high now, the last half a dozen years.
We've had to reduce our rates for apartments for about 10%. And so
Be
we've been able
competitive.
in order to keep them kind of fuller, we've had to reduce our rate.
Yeah. So, it must be a logical inference that the more apartment housing units that get built, when there's not a demand because of an increasing population, it's going to drive rental rates probably down a bit and make it tougher for existing apartment house owners to fill their rooms. That's got to be a correct logic.
There are, and rates have gone down the last 3 years. We've been in a recession, so we've gone down about 10%. And it would be harder, obviously, the more supply there is, the more it puts pressure on us to put rates down, for sure.
But I suspect Mr. Shee's right. Any prospective people that are going to take advantage of this, they're going to be looking at who's going to fill these places. Yeah, but thank you.
Appreciate it, sir. Thank you. Mr. Weddleton.
Since Sean's here,
Oh,
I would
okay.
switch my question a little bit, because, looking at only the broader thing of building more units doesn't make sense to whatever it is. But this does, pretty specifically, it says spurring additional economic development and renewal in a vital portion of the Anchorage community, which is downtown. And it's pretty typical. You want your downtown die. If your downtown dies, you will eventually have to rebuild it and fix it. If you can prevent that slide, then you save yourself a lot of money in the long run. And that's the idea, really predominantly here, I think, more than just building housing. So, how do you respond to that? Is that an illegitimate goal to say, as a city, it's critical for us to have more housing here, and it shuts out the majority of the city? This is
So I guess in response to that, typically when you see tax incentives being offered is because other areas are booming, and the area where the tax incentives are being offered is suffering and it's not being built at. In this case, we don't have that scenario because we don't have any housing being built in all of Anchorage. It's not like there's lots of housing, market rate apartment housing being built in South Anchorage or in Midtown or in West Anchorage. In this case, we don't have any being built. And so what we actually have is a dying Anchorage municipality board when it comes to market rate apartment housing. And this last year, we grow like 1%, but the valley grows at 5%. And so the question really is, well, how do we capture that 5% that's going to the valley? Well, we capture that by building more housing, but right now it's not economical to do it anywhere. And if we do it just downtown, that's great for downtown, but we need more than downtown. We really need it lots of areas.
Can I just follow up briefly? And another point you say that you may not do your project because should this go through, you'll compete with people who build under this tax. So take on it. You think this will work? This will encourage people to build.
Well, if I own property downtown in that circle, I would certainly build.
So that 12 years would tilt a lot of projects.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you. Work sessions are for gathering data, right? And I don't have data, but I have an anecdote, which I just remembered. For whatever reason, probably because my age, I get a lot of my folks from school will email me like, "Hey, my friends moved to Anchorage. Can you help them with one thing or another?" Awesome, you probably get this too, and many others as well. So just recently, a young woman was moving up here, and she was like, "I really want to live downtown." This is like last week. She was coming up to do a PhD, I think, actually. I want to live downtown. And I said, well, some other kind of internship. And I was like, well, I don't really know where you could live downtown. I mean, you should check Craigslist or whatever. And she checked it for a little bit, and she was like, I think I'm going to live in Spenard, actually. It's the only place you could find an appropriate apartment that she'd like. And I just think that is a real thing. And Gretchen, you talked about maybe you want to move downtown. You're exactly the kind of person I want to move downtown. You're responsible person who likes to go on walks. You would go and shop at the Walgreens.
I don't know about the walks.
Drives on the street. I mean,
Yeah.
to have a thriving downtown would help the whole city, and I think it helps when young people are looking at a place to move to.
Oh, you call me young now?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Just
Trying to get
both
you
of
to
them. I want everyone to be able to live where they want to live, but I think it's particularly helpful to have a thriving core that is attractive to people from the outside. And so I am sympathetic to what Sean is saying, Mr. Devonian, but I think it is kind of an irreducible problem. I think if we are trying to spur growth downtown, then we should be upfront about that. And I think that this ordinance is.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I sort of had a deja vu moment because I believe about 4 years ago, we had debated and possibly passed incentives for redevelopment in Fairview in East downtown. Is that 7 years ago? All right. Well, anyway, and I'm just wondering, has that worked? Have we had any feedback on that? Have the project's been developed?
Through the chair, thank you, Mr. Peterson. Yes, the Fairview redevelopment zone created in 2014 is a little bit different tool than this is proposed to be. But to date, we haven't had any users of that tool. One of the challenges, though, I think, was the tool itself, and I think we've learned from a lot of the existing tools that are on the books that typically are not being used, and we've asked those questions: why are they not being used? That's what led us to where we are today, and the application process and the implementation process that we've proposed. So, short answer is no, nobody's taking advantage of it, but we think people will with this one because we've learned from the past mistakes.
This one was a conscious reaction to the inadequacies, if you will, or the lack of use on that one.
On that one, and under the existing 1235 benefits, the economic development property of the deteriorated property.
So we sharpened our pencils on this.
That's right.
All right. Thank you.
Mr. Constant.
boy, he just scratched a sore spot there, the Fairview tax abatement, and it was everything I could do not to add an amendment that would extend the sunset of that project for another 7 years so that we could continue hoping that someone would use it, but rather than Christmas treat this ordinance, which I think stands on its own 2 feet as a good product of the downtown, I've avoided all potential amendments that I thought would be a good vehicle to get my policy goals accomplished. Because I want to keep this one as clean as possible so we can see if it in fact works. And the one thing I heard, it was stated that maybe the RFAs are going to be the next phase of this. I think that that's one way to look at it. But in fact, one thing that this administration has proven their flexibility at looking at projects and trying to figure out ways to make them work if they otherwise can't work, but they're good projects. And so I don't want anyone to lock themselves into thinking that once this passes, that the only next step forward is the RFAs. In fact, if there is a specific area and a specific opportunity that meets some public policy goal, then we actually have the authority to bring that back before the body and ask the question, do we want to do this? And so I want us to not get locked into one path and think, here's how we're going forward. Let's be responsive to the market. And I just wanted to add that to the debate.
Excellent. I've actually run through any other assembly comments, questions. What was passed out, I guess, so we passed out the amended version, and then we passed out LaFrance amendment proposed, and I'll probably have an amendment that takes it from 12 to 10 years. Mr. Gates?
Oh, on this document just passed out. This is a draft. I just watched it should go, but the top says amendment number 1. This isn't number 1. That's wrong. And the header item number and amendment 1. That's wrong. It's just to show you what this reference is intended to amendment 1.
Okay, it's not amendment number 1. Mr. Dunbar.
Mr. Weldon, I wanted to do first. Well, I wanted to ask you a question about your amendment to go from 12 to 10.
Yeah.
Potential amendment. So we've heard from developers, we've heard from the administration saying, this is the number that we've settled on with, more than, it's not just to pull it out of thin air. This is like sort of what they have worked towards with data and study. What are you basing the 10 on? So what countervailing information do you have to suggest that 10 is a more appropriate number?
Right. Well, we heard that they based it on some of the projects that were planned. They also said there's nothing magical about it. I guess we're doing such a, and partly it's in response to conversations with Mr. Debenham and others about that being a dramatic or big number. That we often, that some of the comparable ones and some of the things we've done in the past have been, or have thought about have been shorter. I guess if where do you want to make somewhat of a mistake on this? It being a little too generous or a little lower. We lose tax revenue we would have gotten if we are too generous. And
Can I respond to that? I would lean towards, and this is debate, but just very quickly, I think that we want to lean towards being a little bit too generous, because if you've got projects that are just on the margin, they're a little too generous, well then we'll have a bunch of projects built. But if we're a little bit on the other side, then there's potential for very few or even no projects to be built, right? So if you're dealing with something pretty close to the margin, I would tilt towards being a little too quote-unquote generous. But when you say generous, again, it's really important to remember we haven't had construction of market rate housing downtown in 2 decades or more, right? So we are trying to incentivize something that doesn't exist. We're not giving up any tax revenue because it's not there,
Yeah.
Thank you. To that point, I apologize, Tyler, I'm going to share some of your numbers if that's okay, or Jeff. So as Tyler described, they have run the numbers on the Elizabeth Place project using some market rate assumptions. And one of those assumptions that they used is, let's just imagine that we're setting a $1,400 a month 1-bedroom rental rate, which is a little high, I think, but that's what they've used as part of their base. And then let's look at a 2-bedroom that runs at $1,780. Using those rental amounts, the annual operating income that this place generates doesn't come close to covering the cost of the debt that they have to take on in this market rate environment. In fact, it works out to roughly $86,000 a year over a 12-year period, which is about $740,000 total benefit to this project. The financial gap, though, that Tyler was describing in this project in a market rate environment is over $4.5 million. It's almost $4.5 million. So already you're seeing that the benefit, while it may be help get them incrementally closer to making that decision and pulling the trigger, it's not entirely closing the gap right now. The total development cost of a downtown project or housing project of this type just simply is too high. 10 years takes that number down about $160,000. That could be enough for someone to say no. I'll also add that, much to Mr. Constance's chagrin, part of the reason I think that the Fairview abatement did not work is that the term, the amount of years, the number of years that you could recognize that benefit was small.
What was it?
It was 4 and 8 or it was 8 and 12. No, there was two numbers. There were two benefits that were available, and it turned out that neither one of the options available were enough. And that's the assumption that we saw in the project.
Do you have a list of the comparable statutes from other cities? What other cities have done?
So I'm glad you asked that question. That's also something that we looked at in this analysis. Other jurisdictions, as Mr. Debenham alluded to, other jurisdictions have hot markets. So what they're trying to incentivize is density, and they're staggering their term based on the density. So in a place like Seattle, where they're constructing 600-unit apartment homes or 500-unit apartment homes, the maximum benefit that those can receive is 15-year. As you move down in your density, you're getting lesser and less. We're not Seattle, we recognize that, but in looking at all of the jurisdictions across the Pacific Northwest that use this tool, it's always in that range between 8 and 15. 12 was the number that we ran with to look at the cost, the benefit of it. 12 is the number that a lot of developers, in the feedback that we received from projects they planned, executed, or are planning, is the sweet spot.
Who else wanted on? I had Mr. Dyson. Anybody? Okay, so Mr. Dyson and then over there.
Well, Mr. Croft and Mr. Dunbar, your concerns are valid.
Good to know.
The history, I think, is that government-inspired incentives, it's a very difficult target, rarely hit it. We wanted more oil production in North Slope. We gave huge investment credits for drilling on new structures within the existing lease. It passed through several pay zones. It started second year of the Walker administration. Their reflexed astonishing numbers for the investment credits. And Walker, for one reason or another, refused to pay them. I think that's breaking a deal you made with the investor, even though the investor may have been padding it. 9 years ago, we were worried that we were running out of gas in Cook Inlet for the winter months. And Jim Posey, ML&P, I knew him when I was with BP and he was with ARCO. He wanted to build a landing facility out there to be able to bring LNG in here and regasify, because we were so close to being out of gas. I knew, and USGS and our guys, that there were 17, 19 trillion cubic feet out there. Nobody had ever drilled for gas in Cook Inlet. We changed the tax structures and let the price market, and we got huge amounts of gas. It was always stupid to bring gas in North Slope, and we've got it here, and so on. Guess what? The deal we put together for Cook Inlet served the public process and got us out of the crisis. Those guys are making a killing. I don't know if you had any input, Pete, I think you were still there. We gave them such a sweet deal that the good thing happened, and and so on. We probably should go back and look at that. My first question was, can we go back and look at this? And it's just contract law that binds us to this. And the answer was, yeah.
For those that have already started development.
Sure, but we did the same thing with Prudhoe, and we're about to do it with the Cook Inlet guys. We, the legislature, trying to use some wisdom, have said we made good intentions made a bad deal, and the public's getting shafted.
Came all the way around. Mr. Weddleton and then Ms. LaFrance.
I don't know if I have an amendment, but it's a concern about this, and we have 4 units gets you 4 housing units gets you to 12 years, and I would expect that a small lot, rumor has the Gumbo house, which would be a tremendous loss to Anchorage, goes away, and 4 units of $1 million condos go there or whatever. And that's not my goal here. I want to see lots more housing.
Mr.
Now-
Can I ask him to address that? Why not 8 or 12 or whatever?
Thank you. Through the chair,
Do you mind?
the zoning codes that apply to downtown will still apply even after this ordinance is passed. And so the example of the gumbo house, which I too would be sad to see go away, although I just heard it was a Mexican food place, they would be held to the same zoning standards today or then as they are today. And so the minimum densities that are allowable in downtown, I think, would dictate whether or not you could take a prime location located in the B2A or B2B district and try and build just a fourplex. The example I gave in the presentation, the original presentation, was the parking lot across the street from the transit center, but the same rationale applies. You cannot build just 4 units on that property because there are minimum densities that are required in the zoning code. The 4-unit threshold that we started with comes from 2 places. One, Central Business District encompasses a large area, including portions of Fairview. And because of that, the zoning, once you get across Campbell, is different.
Got it. I apologize, Mr. Wellington. I didn't mean to do that to you, so go ahead.
Well, it's a 7,000 square foot lot, my guess, with all the rules, you get 4 units there. I mean, Seth worked forever to get an R4A to get 7 or something on his 7,000 square feet. So I think we get 4, and that's not our goal. 4 would be okay if they were going to build an office building, though no one's doing that, and they had 4 units on top. Okay, score. That was awesome. But just to have it alone, and I think the quickest, easiest way to get the money out of this is take a lot, put a few high-end buildings on there, because I think that's all that people. So I'm bothered by that. It's like, okay, you do 4 if you have some other structure with it, but if you do less than 8, you get nothing.
Okay.
It's too low a bar.
Just in response real quick, not only is the zoning code at play, but so are the other codes, including the building code, and just physics, what you can do with 7,000 square feet. If the Gumbo House went away and a 4-plex was built or 4 townhouses were built, that would be a great use of that property because it's tiny, it's 7,000 square feet. There's not a lot more that can be fit on that property. The cases where this could be, where this point would be illustrated is if there are larger parcels. Again, this will probably be on the eastern portion, closer to Fairview. But if there are larger parcels where the underlying zoning does not have a density requirement, that's where you can see it. And the example that I'll give is if you own the old Lexus dealership, now furniture store, and for whatever reason decided to demolish that, the standards for redeveloping that and the residential requirements on it could be different than downtown. But ultimately, the goal is, like Mr. Weddleton described, 4-unit minimum for properties that exist currently or properties that are planned is a good threshold. It could be the difference between, as Tyler alluded to, a hotel being built just as a hotel or a hotel being built deciding to add maybe 8 units of residential as part of their plan.
Ms. LaFrance, were you done?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You all have a copy of the amendment that I mentioned earlier. And actually, Mr. Shooty, it's my understanding that your team has drafted the language, and are you good with it?
Yes.
Okay.
It doesn't add new areas. It just states our intent to add
Correct.
new areas. Okay. Mr. Constant?
So that Lexus dealership is a great example because the way our Title 21 is written in the building codes, the change of use on that building make it nearly impossible to do anything of value in there, and it would cause the tenants, they're not the owners, a terrible situation where just to bring it up to standard would be $500,000 or so. And so it's very likely a lot of those buildings are going to go away and have to be done something else with because currently the money isn't on spending all of that money repurposing the buildings.
Any more on
try
this?
that there.
On this issue, any more questions for Mr. Shooty or others? We can move over to the other. Austin just stepped out, but it's just a short one on what do you want for the people listening to NLC
Could we extend? We move to extend 10 minutes?
on this?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it didn't look like there was anybody who
Well,
wanted.
I'm just respecting the time, that's why I'm not asking a question.
We hit the time perfectly. We ran out of questions right when we ran out of time.
So that's no.
We can extend,
that's
but
okay.
nobody had anything they wanted to say. Do you want to say something?
Well, I did.
Okay,
once.
go ahead.
Okay. So I'm kind of, Mr. Welton brought something up that I think is really important to think about. Of course, the Gumbo House could be rebuilt underneath this, is what I'm understanding too, from the possibility. But the the idea of very, well, I was worried about the gumbo house for these guys. That seemed important.
The gumbo basement.
Yeah.
The gumbo.
But it does fit that if businesses were built there and then there were 4 on top. But I go back to the $1 million. I won't be living downtown if I have to buy $1 million condo to live downtown. So I'm kind of going with that whole objective word affordable and the market value, because they're so variable in how things go. So I just wanted to say that also drew my ire a little bit.
There you go.
Yeah.
Ire drawn. Mr. Constable.
Just on that note, again, I want to reiterate the idea of housing incentivization isn't simply to create affordable housing. And in fact, we have Tyler here from a company who specializes in the creation of mixed use and affordable housing. And we want to leave that to the experts who do that, and they aren't having the same barrier that we're finding because the community can in fact give them land or come up with alternative vehicles to make it feasible. And so it's really important to keep our minds onto the idea of not just affordable, but also across the spectrum of housing options. Nice new larger housing units provide relief into the secondary markets nearby them for more affordability. So
Thank you for that clarification.
During this work session,